Today, we're digging into a pretty massive Supreme Court showdown. It really gets to the heart of a huge question. When, if ever, can a president send the military into an American city, especially when the state doesn't want them there? Let's get into it. So this is the core of it all, the question that really split the nation's highest court. Who gets to make that call? And listen, this isn't just some abstract legal debate. This whole thing kicked off because of a very real conflict. And for that, we have to go to Chicago. Protests were happening over federal immigration enforcement. And depending on who you asked, you got two completely different stories about what was going on. On one hand, the Trump administration was saying, hey, our federal officers are being attacked and the local cops aren't doing enough to protect them. But then you had Illinois saying, whoa, hold on. These protests are peaceful and we've got this handled. That massive disagreement is what sent this whole thing spiraling up to the court. So what did the Trump administration do? Well, they made a pretty big move. They pulled out this rarely used federal law and federalized about 300 National Guard members to go into Chicago to protect federal buildings and personnel. As you can probably guess, Illinois wasn't having it. They sued immediately to block the deployment, and this case just shot right up the ladder to the Supreme Court. So let's break down how the court's majority actually sided with the state. You know, it's kind of wild. This entire huge case really boiled down to the meaning of just two words: regular forces. See, the law says the president can only use the Guard when he can't execute the laws with his regular forces. But what are regular forces? And this is where the court split right down the middle. The majority said, look, regular forces means the actual military, the Army, the Navy, etc. So their logic was, the president hadn't even tried to use the Army yet, so he couldn't use the Guard. But the dissenters, they completely disagreed. They argued regular forces just meant the civilian federal officers already there, like ICE. But the majority didn't stop there. They made another really important distinction. They said the mission for the Guard in Chicago, basically just protecting people in buildings, that's not the same thing as executing the laws. It's like they drew a line in the sand between being a security guard and being a police force. And this is where their argument gets super interesting. They basically set up this legal catch-22. They said, look, if protecting officers did count as executing laws, well then that would probably violate a whole other law, the Posse Comitatus Act. And that's the big one that's supposed to keep the military from acting like a police force on U.S. soil. So the administration was kind of stuck. But Justice Samuel Alito and two other justices saw this completely differently. And Alito wrote this fiery dissent that really went after the majority's entire line of thinking. You see, while the majority was focused on these very specific legal definitions, Alito brought it right back to the street level. He basically argued that the court was getting lost in the weeds and ignoring the president's basic duty to protect his officers from what he called potentially lethal attacks. For him, this was about safety, not semantics. And man, he did not pull any punches. He called the majority's decision unwise. He said their focus on the Posse Comitatus Act was puzzling, and he even called them out for basing their entire ruling on what he felt was a last-minute argument from Illinois that nobody had really had a chance to properly debate. Then Alito pointed out this really strange contradiction in the majority's logic. He warned it could lead to outlandish results. He said, okay, follow me here. If the majority says the Guard can't do purely protective stuff, does that mean they can be used for more intense police-like actions, like actually arresting people? It's a bizarre outcome that seems to go against the whole reason we try to keep the military out of domestic policing in the first place. So let's zoom out. Why does this fight over a single deployment in Chicago matter to everyone else? Because the ripple effects from this could be felt all across the country. The final vote was 6-3, so it was a clear split. And it's really important to remember this decision was just a temporary block. It stopped the deployment for now, but the case is still making its way through the lower courts. This fight is far from over. But what this case does is put the limits of presidential power directly under the microscope. The outcome could set a huge precedent for future showdowns between the federal government and states. We saw similar tensions in Portland and California. At its very core, this case is about that classic American balancing act. Where does the federal government's authority stop, and is states' right to govern itself begin? And that's the big, messy, unresolved question we're left with. In a country that feels more divided than ever, Just where do we draw that line between ensuring national security and respecting state sovereignty? The Supreme Court offered a temporary answer, but the debate itself? Yeah, that's not going away anytime soon.